about that, ladies. Right, so thank you for joining me on this webinar. And I'm Michelle Atkin, and I run Easy Breastfeeding and Conversations That Connect. And I called the title of this webinar, Call Me Rumina. Now, Rumina was a Greek goddess of breastfeeding, and milk was offered to this goddess instead of wine, and she was represented by a fig tree. And actually, the sap of a fig is milky white, and it's got great links to fertility as well. And while we're talking about mythology and goddesses, the Milky Way is also born out of Greek mythology, or one of the theories is it's born out of Greek mythology. The story goes that when Heracles was a baby, his father was Zeus, who was one of the chief gods, and he loved his son. And he was a result of a liaison with a mortal woman. So Zeus decided that he wanted Heracles to be endowed with godlike qualities. So he wanted him to suckle from his goddess wife, Hera. So while she was asleep, he put the baby to her breast. Now, when Hera woke up and discovered that she'd actually been breastfeeding her husband's mistress's baby, rightly so, she pushed him away. And as a result of that, milk spurted everywhere, and we have the Milky Way. I think that's a lovely story, and it rather amused me through the week when we had all the furore in the papers about breastfeeding in public places. I thought then, if that goddess had been in Manchester in that aquatic centre, she would, oh my goodness, she would just been banned for life. Anyway, from my personal point of view, I have been supporting women for over 11 years now in various settings. I set up Little Angels Breastfeeding Support, which was a breastfeeding support organisation in the northwest of England, and it spread across the UK. And during my career supporting women, I've had the privilege of speaking at UNICEF Baby Friendly Conference. I've also spoken in Georgia, Atlanta, at an international health marketing conference. Numerous conferences across the UK. I've organised a couple of national breastfeeding conferences. We had Jill Rapley, Gay Palmer, James Accra, Suzanne Coulson attend. The organisation that I ran, we supported over 20,000 women. And we were very privileged, or I was very privileged, to also be able to input into NICE guidelines around breastfeeding peer support and national and local breastfeeding policies. I've also trained health professionals and peer supporters in the subject of breastfeeding. So that's sort of a little bit of a professional background, shall we say. I'm also qualified as a doula, and I do a lot of work around coaching and empowering women, certainly during the natal period, and mothers going back to work, family life, balancing the two. I do a lot of work around that as well. Anyway, what we're here to talk about tonight is my own breastfeeding experiences. Now, one of my sort of little party tricks when people meet me is I love to tell them how many children I've got, because I have 7 children. And not only do I have 7 children, I've had them over 4 childbearing decades. So I had my youngest when I was 18, then I had 2 in my 20s, 3 in my 30s, and the last one in my 40s. So I have a span of 26 years of having children. I have breastfed for 14 years and continue to do so. Charlie, my youngest, is still breastfeeding. And I have a real passion that we need to make breastfeeding normal, and we need to make it fashionable. So I'd like to share my breastfeeding experiences with you, with each of the children, and how they were very different, not only from a breastfeeding point of view, but also from the point of view of society and health professionals and people who were around me. So we shall start with Robert. Robert is my eldest son. That is him there at 3 weeks. I'm not quite sure what the expression's about. Somebody did suggest it was something along the lines of, oh no, it's not a bottle of formula, don't bring that near me. But Robert was born in a maternity home when I was 18. I'd always planned to breastfeed. It was one of those questions I was asked when I was expecting, how are you going to feed? And it didn't really compute. I didn't understand the question. My auntie had breastfed, and I was surrounded by women that breastfed. It was just assumed that's what I would do. So I had Robert. Everything was fine, straightforward. And in this lovely maternity home where the rabbits ran outside and all the meals were home cooked, it was lovely. But there were some very old-fashioned views around breastfeeding. One of the views was, and this is what I did as an 18-year-old, when you first started breastfeeding, on the first day, you breastfed a minute on either side. Very strict. So you sat in front of the clock and you watched the little second hand go around till it reached a minute and you stopped. And if your baby was still hungry, and surprise, surprise, they usually were, you then put them on the other side and did it for another minute. And that was it for 4 hours. Nothing else in between. Babies didn't need feeding more than every 4 hours. I did this religiously. And Robert religiously cried and objected to the fact he only got a minute each side, but I could quite understand why this child didn't understand the concept of that's what you do. And the other thing about being in the maternity home was that you had a separate nursery. So at night time, you were not allowed to stop in the ward. You certainly weren't allowed to bed share. Oh my goodness me, I think the matron would have had an absolute duck fit if you'd bed shared. In fact, you couldn't even put your baby in your bed, if I remember rightly. You had to walk in the corridor with the baby several times a night, very quietly. You mustn't let it bang or crash. The other mothers needed their sleep. And you had to go and feed in the nursery. Anyway, this went on for a couple of days. Day 2, he got 2 minutes either side, so it was getting more fortunate. By the time day 3 came, this child just cried. And he cried and he cried. And I remember the matron midwife coming down the corridor, and she was a large lady, and I mean large, in this vivid blue uniform, starched, marched down the corridor, came into our room. There was four in a room, with a bottle of whatever the formula was at the time, picked him up out of his cot, plonked it in his mouth, and said with a very smug expression, "See, he was hungry." Well, I think there was various expressions came to mind, none of which I shall repeat on this webinar. But, nothing like stating the obvious. Of course his child was hungry. He'd been fed 1 minute, 2 minutes if he was lucky, every 4 hours for the last 48 hours of his life. The poor child was starving. So we didn't get off to the best start with breastfeeding. Persevered at home. I still kept to the schedule, 2 minutes, 4 minutes, 8 minutes. I think we probably got up to about 10 minutes, 15 minutes at one point either side, every 4 hours. So I did a lot of pacing up and down with this child that just cried incessantly because he was hungry. So we got to 6 weeks, and my mum said, "Well, give him a bottle of formula at night time, he'll sleep." No, he didn't. He cried even more. That didn't work at all. So at 6 weeks, we also went for our 6 week checkup. Lovely doctor, lovely family doctor, who was given the long, sorry story of how this child had never slept through the night yet and how terrible it was and he should be doing by now and he was a good birth weight. So his suggestion was he needs solids. So at 6 weeks, I duly started giving him solids. I gave him baby rice. And if you've ever tasted baby white rice, I'll tell you now, you're better off giving him wallpaper paste. It made no difference, absolutely whatsoever. So we persevered with the solids. So by the time he was 3 months, he was having 3 meals a day. And we were also doing a neat little trick I'd learned, that babies have a very sweet tooth, and we were using baby jars. So he didn't like his savouries. So what I used to do, I used to get the Heinz chocolate pudding, which I have to say is particularly scrummy, and give him a mouthful of that. So he got used to it. And then he would be expecting that. And then inadvertently, I used to shovel in a spoonful of something that he should be having. Anyway, Robert did survive. He's now a 6'2" strapping lad who is a manager at Asda. Has severe stomach problems, which he absolutely lays the blame at my doorstep. He says it's my fault for not breastfeeding him for long enough and giving him solids too soon and giving him chocolate pudding. So that's Robert's. I have to say I did try to relactate at about 6 months because I felt bad. I felt I should have breastfed for longer. I should have done it better. I should have done things differently. But he wasn't having any of it. Absolutely no way was he having any of it. But I was 18, I was young. You do as you're told. It was an experience. I then went on to have his sister, Kezia. This is Kezia. At about 3 months old, I think. She was a good weight baby, nearly 8 pounds. We breastfed. I think we'd moved away from the 1 minute either side. It was more along the lines of perhaps every 3 hours. It wasn't too bad, so we did every 3 hours. If she wanted feeding or was hungry in between that, she was given water, and that seemed to do a trick. That certainly was a trick that worked. When she was 3 weeks old, she was in hospital with bronchiolitis, and they'd not quite come across a breastfeeding baby very often in this neck of the woods, so they weren't quite sure what to do with her. feeding wise. I mean, from a clinical point of view, that they looked after her really well. And they used to weigh her before and after a feed in hospital, which was just ridiculous because you had to wait around for the nurses to come with the weighing scales and weigh her before a feed, and she was crying and she was ill. Weigh her afterwards, and then, oh my goodness, she's only taken 2 ounces. It was like, well, she's breastfed, she's ill, what do you expect? Anyway, she recovered and she was fine. She came home. And the policy had slightly changed with weaning. It wasn't sort of carte blanche, start when you want. It changed to 12 weeks or £12. Now, she got to £12 before she got to 12 weeks. So, Kezia started on solids probably about, I don't know, 10 weeks, 8, 9, 10 weeks. And it was just the done thing. That's what we did. We didn't question it. We just did it. We bought the packets, we bought the jars. I would never have dreamt of giving normal food. Why would you do that when you can buy a packet? And again, she's here. She's a teacher. She teaches secondary school children for her sins. She's now nearly 25. And that was my experience with Kezia. Very similar to Robert's. Perhaps I was a little more relaxed about things. And then we move on to Tammy. Tammy, and she is about a week old on that picture, and she had loads of hair. She was a model when she was a baby. She was a very cute baby. Tammy, again, we did the giving water between feeds. We introduced formula at about 4 months because I was returning to work. Now, a couple of stories around Tammy. One of them is when I returned to work at 4 months, we were still doing some breastfeeding. We were still doing the morning and whenever I could breastfeed, I used to do it. So I wanted to be able to just work mornings. I worked in the local court system. I was a court usher. I was the first female usher in Lancashire. So surrounded by a very male-dominated environment, very old-fashioned male-dominated environment. They were retired police officers from the very, very old school. So, I thought it was quite reasonable, this. I wanted to just do mornings, and I was met with opposition. It was sort of said, no, you can't do that. It's not fair on everybody else. So I think this is where my activism started, because at about the same time, there'd been an indirect sex discrimination case with British Rail. So armed with this information, I then went to see my boss and allowed him to say, well, Michelle, we can't make exceptions. You're just going to have to fit in with the rest of them. And then I plonked this case in front of him. Bear in mind, I work in the court system, and sort of said to him, I'd just like to point out before you make an absolute final decision that British Rail have just been successfully sued for indirect sex discrimination for not allowing a mother to return to work on the terms that were reasonable. Let's just say I got the terms that I wanted, and I think that probably kick-started my activism around women's rights and, being able to return to work in a family-friendly environment. And the other story around Tammy is when I had Tammy in 1995, a very good friend of mine had her son about a month later, David. Now, David was £9, no, he was £10.6 at birth. He was a big baby. She'd got gestational diabetes, so he was an unusually large baby. So she had David, and to my amazement, this is 1995, so way before UK recommendations. Linda chose to breastfeed for 6 months exclusively, absolutely exclusively. She introduced no water, no formula, no solids, and I was so impressed. I couldn't believe it. I was so impressed with this. And she continued to breastfeed till he was gone too. And it's the first time I'd come across not only exclusive breastfeeding for a set time, but also the fact that you could continue to breastfeed for a long time, or longer than I would have expected you to. Linda gave me a book, The Womanly Art of Breastfeeding, the Bible to anybody who breastfeeds. And I read it and I thought, this just makes sense. It's just absolutely makes sense. And I said then, if I had any more children, that's what I was going to do. Exclusively breastfeed, because I'd seen Linda do it with this baby that was huge. And he was fine, he thrived, he was a big bouncing baby. And I thought, that's what I'm going to do. So in 1999, I got my chance to do it. I had my fourth baby, Leia. This is Leia at 6 months, breastfeeding, obviously. That's me. On my wedding day, I breastfed Leia when I got married. So I carefully chose my dress. I had it specially made. So it was a top and skirt and was quite accessible. And we breastfed at the wedding, which was lovely. The story with Leia when she was born in hospital as well. And by this time, the hospital had now become baby friendly accredited. It wasn't with my previous three. So I had Leia. Again, everything straightforward. And I'd learnt the trick that to sort of make the baby go longer between feeds, you give them water. So I dutifully trundled down to the midwife station and asked for a bottle of water and was told, well, I thought you were breastfeeding. Well, I am. Well, though we don't give water to breastfeeding babies. Oh, I was mortified, offended. You know, who do these people think they are? This is my child. I'm a mother of 4. I know what I'm doing. How ridiculous. It worked with the other 3. To be fair to the midwives, they did sit down with me and explain in detail why it wasn't a good idea. And I took it on board. And fine. I breastfed Leia exclusively till 6 months. And then we did baby led weaning. Just naturally, it was one of those things that sort of made sense. My mother in law was completely intrigued by this because this was her first grandchild. This is my second wedding. She'd formerly fed my husband, Nigel, and was completely mesmerised by the whole procedure. My father-in-law was as well. He thought it was great, and in his own way supported me. He'd come out with the usual comments of, "Oh, lucky thing, can I have the other side?" But they were very supportive. And by the time 3-4 months came, my mother-in-law came around to the idea of breastfeeding, and actually sort of said, "I don't know why I didn't, and I wish I had," which was really nice. And breastfeeding was just one of those things that I did. It was simple, it was straightforward, it was easy. I suppose I was very intolerant of people who didn't understand why they didn't, because I found it so easy. That was to change at a later point, which I shall share. So that's Leia. That's baby number 4. Got to keep up at times. Remembering all the birthdays is a feat in itself. This is Lucas, baby number 5. Lucas, again, straightforward birth, breastfed, no problems, just got on with it. And at around 4 months, the health visitor came round for her weaning visit. I remember this. Leia would be about, she would be 2.5. Leia had started talking at 9 months and never shut up since. Leia had a wonderfully perfect set of teeth and talked really well. The health visitor came at 4 months and was talking about weaning. By this time, I'd done a lot of research and discovered the World Health Organization recommended exclusive breastfeeding until 6 months and then to continue for as long as you want. So I said, well, actually, I'm waiting till he's 6 months old. That's what I did with Leia, and that's what I'm going to do with Lucas. It's easier. You just go straight onto straight onto finger food. You cut out all the mess, all the mush. She was mortified. I cannot emphasize or stress how upset and horrified she was. She told me that there was a window of opportunity between the ages of 4 and 6 months, which enabled a baby to be able to eat solid foods. And if you miss this window of opportunity, your baby would A, never eat again properly, B, never speak properly, C, his teeth would not develop properly. I can never work out for the life of me what the correlation is between teeth development and weaning. She clearly thought there was one. And his jaw would be out of line. Okay, fine. Would you care to share me the evidence that you've got that supports all that? Well, that's just the way it is. That's just the way it is. So a little bit like your Blue Peter, when you used to make Blue Peter things, I sort of said to her, "Oh, let me introduce you to Leia, one I made earlier. The one I made earlier that spoke at 8 months. The one I made earlier that walked very soon, has got perfect teeth. Not a lot wrong with her jaw, apart from the fact she never keeps it still because she talks that much. Now, let me explain to you, Leia was also weaned at 6 months. She still wasn't convinced and was quite upset about it. The UK government recommend 4 months. The World Health Organization recommends 6 months. I said, and in my book, the World Health Organization have a slightly higher authority than the UK government, which can change every 4 years anyway. She clearly knew she wasn't going to win and sort of huffed and puffed and left saying, "I suppose it's your baby. I suppose you're right." I have to say, several years later, probably about 4 or 5, when the 6-month policy came in the UK, by this time I was training health professionals on breastfeeding management and weaning and how to, teach mothers correctly. And lo and behold, who came in my teaching group was the same said health visitor. I have to say, it was a very pleasant experience for myself to be able to show from official point of view that actually baby-led weaning from 6 months old was now the official recommendation. But, I mean, Lucas, he was fine. He breastfed till he was 3.5, 4. Leia was about 18 months. She stopped when I was pregnant with Lucas. Lucas continued to breastfeed for a long time. He had some little cute tricks, like when he got into trouble off his dad and was put on the naughty chair, he would suddenly go, "But I need a bubble," and sort of get around that. I remember his dad taking him to a father's group they used to go to, and Irish Shoe Start was very pro breastfeeding, really pro breastfeeding, and they had all the bravado nursing bra posters up. So Nigel went into this father's group with all the other dads and their children. Lucas would be about 3. And Lucas saw the pictures. And Lucas just went, "Oh, look, Daddy, boo-boos." Well, my poor husband was mortified. He's like, "He's breastfed, he's breastfed, he's breastfed." But it just goes to show that children just find it so normal and natural. And that's just what they do. By this time, like I said, Shoe Start was up and running, and I was invited to a Shoe Start board meeting. So I went along with Lucas, who would be about 8 or 9 months. He was beginning to, toddle crawl around. And there was a room full of people. They were all board members, so it was quite overbearing, quite scary, really. For first time I'd ever done anything like that. So as I looked around the room, sat were lots of people in suits, and there was a big builder there. He was a councillor as well. A councillor, as in a local authority councillor. He was there, and he was a builder, and he was a big man. And he needed breast. Lucas wanted to feed him, so I thought, okay. So I started feeding him, and I caught Frank's eye, and I saw Frank look at me, and I thought, here we go, we're gonna get it. And he just went, brilliant, fantastic. That's what we need to see. More mothers breastfeeding, fantastic. And it really taught me a lesson as to not to judge people as to how they're going to react to you when you breastfeed. Because he was the last person I thought would say that. And he's always been so supportive going forward. And that's when I started the first breastfeeding support group. I was asked by one of the midwives to come along. She was recruiting people she knew who had some breastfeeding experience, and I went to the first one, and it was sort of like a get to know you meeting, and they all went round the room. There'd be about 8 of us, and every single person had a horrendous story to tell. It was how awful it had been, how they'd given up, how they'd never do it again. And it got to me, and I'm sat there thinking, I actually enjoy breastfeeding. I, you know, And I was like a bit lost. I thought, now, do I sort of join in with everybody else and make something up? Or do I sort of say, actually, I quite enjoy it? Going forward, the breastfeeding support group was very successful and went on and led into Little Angels Breastfeeding Support. But it was just amazing that out of 8 of us, there was only one, myself, that had a really positive experience. So then we move on to Jenna, that is Jenna, eating spaghetti. See her sitting up nicely. She's about 9 months old there. They just dive in, don't they, when you let them baby-led weaning. Jada was born at home. I always said I would never have a home birth. I was asked when I was expecting Kezia if I wanted a home birth. I didn't quite understand the question as to why on earth would you want to do that. But when I came to be expecting Jenna, I was then working within the midwifery field, and I'd started developing Little Angels, so I was surrounded by midwives and breastfeeding. And actually, the midwives assumed I would have Jenna at home. It was just an assumption. And I got to thinking about it, and I thought, well, actually, there's no reason why I shouldn't. I am only 5 minutes away from the hospital if it goes wrong. Like, I don't see why I thought it would go wrong, because the other 5 were perfectly normal, straightforward births. So that was my view. Okay, yes, we'll do it at home. If I'm blued and tooed into the hospital, I would probably be seen quicker than somebody who was already there. And let's see what happens. And it was a fantastic experience. It was just so different. It was so relaxed. It was so, you could just do what you want. And the big selling point for me was no stitches. Excellent. Big selling point. So, yeah, Jenny was born at home. While I was pregnant, I also then set up Little Angels and just breastfed her whenever and wherever. I did it in meetings with commissioners, um, just people in strategic positions, the bank manager, at conferences I've breastfed while presenting. Wherever I went, she went, and it became the accepted norm that, oh, here comes Michelle, and she clearly will have a baby attached to her breast. And it was just something that happened, um, and it worked really, really well. I had some professional photographs done of her breastfeeding, which were used extensively across the country. Were used by the NCT. Were still used by the NCT now. Used by the Breastfeeding Festival. We were on TV several times. Jenna loves nothing more than for me to tell her the story of when she was famous and on television and on the radio. And there was no issues with Jenna. She became the face of breastfeeding, and that's just what happened with her. And then Charlie. I had Charlie when I was 41. I had Charlie at home. He was a home birth baby. Now, bear in mind, I was 41, so I was an ancient mother. Ancient mother. I was multi gravia. Seventh baby. Low iron count. The risks were just stacked, according to my consultant. The midwives didn't bat an eyelid. They were just like, oh, yeah, it'll be fine. What's the problem? So I went to see this consultant because it was policy, and I thought, fair enough. I won't upset anybody yet. So I went to see this consultant, who I have to say, I think I had underwear older than her. I certainly had children older than her, who looked through my medical records, sort of observed that I'd had a previous home birth, yes, and condescended to say, okay, I'll let you have a home birth. Now, I knew the midwives very well, and there was one stood behind this consultant who knew who I was and knew how I was. And I could see her almost cringing at this point. So I said, oh, right, okay, thank you very much. That's so kind of you, even though it's my right to have a home birth. But, she says, I want to see you back at 37 weeks. Okay, so I took a deep breath and just said to her, you will see me back at 37 weeks, only if my midwife advises it, and only if there's something wrong. Otherwise, you will not be seeing me again. By this point, the midwife in the corner was practically on the floor, wetting herself with laughter. But yeah, Charlie, he was born at home. He was 10 days late, I think. I was 41. He was my seventh baby. My iron count was like 9.2. No problems at all. It was just, we had a physiological third labour. And interestingly enough, of all the 7 children, he is the only one who has not had any jaundice. All the others did, and they had a managed third stage where they cut the cord. They cut the cord quite quickly, and they used the synthetic oxytocin for the delivery of the placenta. With Charlie, it was a physiological third stage, and none of that happened. I have to say, with Charlie, bear in mind, I at this point have had 6 children over a 22-year period. I had worked extensively with women to support their parenting choices, not only in breastfeeding, but in other strategies. I taught about breastfeeding management. I supported about breastfeeding management. I talked at national and international levels about breastfeeding. How easy and simple it was. How it was like falling out of a tree. How it was the most natural thing in the world. And everybody can do it, apart from perhaps 2% of the population. And then I got Charlie. And I have to say, he was a child from hell. If Charlie had been a first child, he would have been an only child. Charlie challenged every one of my parenting strategies, every one of my breastfeeding strategies. And I wondered what I got. I really didn't know what I got. What I did do, or what I did feel, was very inadequate because I was sort of the breastfeeding guru who helped everybody else. And also, I'd helped midwives health visitors to breastfeed their own children. And suddenly it was, well, who do I ask? Who do I go to help from? And I went to um, the infant feeding advisor of our local authority, who was brilliant, and we overcame it. We did um, biological nurturing, and it worked really well. But I have to say, he was the baby that absolutely challenged me, completely and utterly challenged me. But saying that, we're still breastfeeding. He's going to be 4 in December. We are still breastfeeding. Um, we have no issues around it. Once we got over the initial 3 or 4 weeks, it was fine. But I think all the breastfeeding issues and problems that people normally have, I got them all with Charlie. I think it was a big learning curve, which is fine. But to me, it just goes to show that absolutely no two babies are the same. Certainly, none of mine have been the same. They've perhaps been similar, but they've all been very different as well. They all feed differently, they all sleep differently. Some don't sleep at all, some still don't sleep at all at nearly 4. And it all been very different. Now, I suppose, what have I learned across the ages? I think the one thing I've learned across the ages is health professionals and evidence changes. So, for example, when I was expecting Robert 27 years ago, my mother told me that when she was expecting me, she was told to eat raw liver. When I was expecting Robert 27 years ago, I was told that yes, you could have liver and we should do, but you must cook it. And then when I came to be expecting probably Jenna or Charlie, liver was absolutely a no-no. It was dangerous. You think, oh my goodness me, so much has changed in such a short period of time. And with lots of other things, weaning is another big one. That's just changed. In my own experience, it jumped from 6 weeks to 12 weeks to 12 pounds to 4 months to 6 months. I mean, there's talk of it going back again now. But the one thing that is consistent all the way through my experience is mothers have an instinct for breastfeeding. We get pregnant normally without much interference from the outside world, usually 98% of the time. We carry our babies normally with no interference from the outside world. We birth our babies pretty normally most of the time. And we can breastfeed our babies pretty normally most of the time. And that is the one thing that never changed. The fact that, your instincts are right and mothers need to be empowered to trust their instincts, like you trust yourself when you're pregnant. I mean, it's unusual to meet a pregnant woman who worries 24/7 about her baby when she's pregnant. You just don't. You just accept that your body will get on with it. You don't sit there thinking, I wonder how much blood's passed from the placenta to the baby today and back again. And we just accept we can do it. And that's it with breastfeeding. The other thing I've learned across the ages is mums and babies need support to breastfeed. It may be natural, but it doesn't always come naturally. And that's down to society. They do say it's not a woman that breastfeeds, it's a society that breastfeeds. And I fully endorse that. And mother and baby both need support to be able to get off to a good start. The other thing I've learned is breastfeeding is normal. Breastfeeding isn't fantastic or wonderful or magical. Or, you're just up there with the gods if you can do it. You're up there on a pedestal with, it's so marvellous. Women don't want that kind of prestige. They just want to do what's normal. They just want to do what we do naturally. And by making breastfeeding normal, we lower the standard. So, as soon as you give birth, you start giving birth to guilt anyway, or perceived guilt. And we try and pile it on with the breastfeeding, and yeah, it's just a normal thing to do. It's just that is the benchmark. Anything else is below it. Um, so that's what I've learned across the ages. I've also learned it's a very emotive subject. It is the Marmite subject. You either hate it or you love it, but you will have an opinion. Down to I used to ring up for car insurance, and what do? I'm a breastfeeding coordinator and director of a breastfeeding company. Oh, and no matter who it was, I tell you now, whether it was a woman or man, they would have some breastfeeding story to share with me, either their partner or them or something else. And no matter where I went, there was always a breastfeeding story, even in the most obscure places. At one point, I used to be able to have a party trick of throw any subject at me, and I can turn it around to breastfeeding, and I used to, I absolutely used to. Ah, that's all my children now. That was taken at Tammy's 18th. She is on the back, on the left, the redhead, right at the back. So that's them all now. As you can see, Robert is he works at Asda. Kezia is a teacher. Tammy is an artist. Leia is an actress. Lucas, who sat at the back, has just gone to high school. Jane at the front, pulling some kind of strange face, is a typical girly girl. And Charlie is Charlie. He is one on his own. He's very adorable. I mean, we've just got a few minutes left to talk about some common problems. Some common problems and perhaps questions that arisen with breastfeeding. Things we used to get commonly were mums would ring up. Now, this is a common one, and they would say, I don't know what to do. My mum's saying I shouldn't keep picking the baby up. I'm going to spoil it. Okay, so what happens? So you talk through it. Well, every time the baby cries, I just want to pick it up, but I'm being told that I should get it into a routine. The question I used to ask is, how old is your baby? And the number of times I got, oh, well, it's 2 weeks now. Oh, well, it's 10 days now. And I could cry. I could absolutely cry. And I used to say to mums, look, you've been pregnant for 9 months. For 9 months, your baby has exclusively had contact with you. It's been able to listen to your heartbeat. At the point where they could open their eyes, it's been able to make out, you know, shapes, etc. That is you. It's been able to smell within the womb, and it's had all its five senses stimulated by you. It's never been left on its own. It's had its food on demand. And then suddenly, not only do they go through the trauma of birth and bright lights and being weighed and bottoms being slapped and being wrapped up and what have you, we then want to put them in cots away from us. If you think about it from a baby's perspective, you put a baby in a cot in a room on its own. It can no longer see you. It can't hear you. It can't touch you. And it can't smell you. You've just suddenly abandoned it. And then they wonder why they cry. It is so obvious why they cry. Babies are made to be with their mothers. I used to say to mothers, you are actually pregnant for 15 months. You carry your baby internally for 9 months, and you carry your baby externally for 6 months. And that's where they want to be. They want to be next to their mothers. I mean, the Continuum Concept is a fantastic book. And it's about, if you've not read it, read it. Continuum Concept. It was an anthropologist who studied a tribe who, and from this, developed the Continuum Concept. But their babies were worn for 6 months. They didn't touch the ground for 6 months. And that's what babies do. They're made to be worn. The other one is, can I overfeed a baby? You can't overfeed a breastfed baby. Impossible to overfeed a breastfed baby as long as you're breastfeeding it. Clearly, if you're giving it McDonald's every day, you're overfeeding it. But from a breastfeeding point of view, you can't overfeed your breastfed baby. They put weight on at the weight that they put it on. And breast milk has that wonderful enzyme that enables, develops appetite control as well. Routine. Oh, I must get my baby into a routine. Why? Whose routine? Yours or its? It's just, the routine is one that you will develop together if that's the label you want to put on it. Babies do what babies do. And it's for us to be able to adapt towards it. And then the other one is when, what age should I stop feeding? Well, at whatever age you choose to make that decision together. You're a diet. You are together. You make that decision together, and it isn't for anybody else to impose upon that. You do it for as long as you want to, or as short as you want to, and nobody else can dictate what is right and what's not. You go with your instinct. I mean, there was a question the other day about, what do I do when my partner wants me to stop? Well, it's times like that you need to be able to sit down and find out what the underlying issues are. Um, what is it that's going on more than the breastfeeding here? Because I suspect there is usually something else going on. And that sort of leads on to, what about dad? He feels left out because he can't feed. Okay, but did he feel left out when you were pregnant? The answer is usually no. Did he feel left out in labour? But he didn't feel left out then. Um, and I used to say to this mums antenatally when dads were there, what about me? I can't feed the baby. And I would say to dad, you are 7 months pregnant. Do you talk to the baby? Yes. Do you stroke her tummy? Yes. Have you bonded with the baby? Of course I have. Okay. But you're not feeding it. You're not carrying it. You won't birth it. It will not prevent you from bonding if you don't breastfeed it. And nature dictates it's women that breastfeed. And the reality of it is, men don't usually get up in the middle of the night anyway. So, if you breastfeed your baby at night, your dad gets a better quality of sleep. It makes him much easier to deal with during the day. He can go to work. He can support you much better. And the breastfeeding period, exclusive breastfeeding period, is only a short period of time. It's only 6 months. It's not even as long as pregnancy. And I don't hear many men complaining that they're not pregnant. The other common questions tend to be, oh, how do we know they're getting enough? When you're feeding a bottle, you can see like 4, 6, 8 ounces. Yeah, and yeah, fair enough. Our breasts don't carry a full empty signal. Our babies do. Our babies will tell you when they're full. They have a very distinct signal. When a baby is hungry, it will have its hands up by its face, and it gets fuller and fuller. Its hands will drop by its side. So, our breasts may not have markings on them to say when they're empty, or when they're full, but our babies do. And, it's simple things like, barring any unusual things like tongue tie, weight gain, nice steady weight gains, plenty of wet and dirty nappies. Baby's growing, so are they growing out of their clothes? Is the baby happy and alert in between feeds? Again, common sense, instinct. Mothers are born, parents are born with an instinct. We have an instinct, otherwise we would not have survived. I'm a firm believer that when a baby's born, it's already formed a connection with its mother and its dad, but more so with its mother. And as mothers, we communicate with our babies before language develops, way before language develops. We communicate so that even before they start crying, or that few seconds before they wake up, we will wake up before they do. We have an inbuilt, innate response system to our children, to our babies. So, a lot of the time, the biggest issue with parenting is lack of self-belief, lack of confidence, and lack of trust in instincts. And, for me, with breastfeeding, a lot of the breastfeeding support in this country is excellent. The issue I have with it is it's all at behaviour level. It's either at behaviour level or environmental level. So we change the environment for breastfeeding women, so therefore we make it against sex discrimination laws to discriminate against a breastfeeding woman. That's changing the environment. We're changing the environment by trying to get people to accept breastfeeding in public. We then also try to change behaviour. So when breastfeeding issues and challenges come up, we teach breastfeeding. So we show the behaviour. We show how to do it. We teach mothers how to do it. A lot of the time, the issues around whether mothers choose to breastfeed or not is not at environment or behaviour level. It's right up there at identity level. It's right up there with what it says about you as a parent. And I know by talking to mothers who chose not to breastfeed, or did it reluctantly through gritted teeth, because some mums do, that it's at identity level. It says something about them as a person. It's not seen to be something they do. Mothers tend not to say I breastfeed. They tend to say I am a breastfeeder. I am a breastfeeding mother. It's identity level, and I strongly feel that that's a level that we should be looking at to increase the breastfeeding rates in the Western world. It's identity level. How you identify yourself as a mother, how you identify yourself with society. It's not behaviour and environment, because you can change that, absolutely. And because it's, and I know it's not that, because if it was only at behaviour and environment level, everybody would breastfeed, and they don't. So it's much higher up the the triangle. Can't remember what it's called now. So I may be out of I'm no longer with Little Angels, but I'm still very, very passionate about breastfeeding and I have very, very strong beliefs about it. And that's why I continue to do the easy breastfeeding and I continue to support mums. And because of my additional skills I've learned since then, so around coaching and hypnotherapy and being able to offer that sort of different level of support, you mix it in with the breastfeeding, and I think it makes an unusual mix and it makes a very unique mix. Um, and that's my approach. I sort of look at it as a coaching exercise because at the end of the day, we all we have that ability to be able to support our children. Um, so yeah. So what did I learn? I learned that all the way along, you can do it anywhere. You just need the right support and the right mechanisms in place. So I mean, I hope you've enjoyed listening to my story for the last hour. Um, I know we had a few problems at the beginning, but I think we got there in the end. So yes, that's my story of breastfeeding over 2 millennia, 4 childbearing decades, 7 children, 14 years. Um, and yes, I hope you enjoyed it. And thank you very much.